I've just written a book on immigration, which is going to be published by Time Warner outside the US, and it would be great if we got a Latin American publisher, because I think it's very important that the messages in the book, which are very relevant to Latin America, are heard not only in the English language. There's a paradox here. We live in a globalizing world where goods and services move around the world ever more freely, where money moves around the world almost effortlessly, and yet where we try to obstruct the natural movement of people. Now, this is economically utterly inefficient. There are jobs that need doing in rich countries, there are people in poor countries who want to do them, and yet we prevent this happening. Meanwhile, there is a superclass of rich people and increasingly educated people who can move around the world freely. They can go for holidays wherever they want. They can go work for a couple of years in a financial center. But for the rest of the people, we say, no, you're tied to the land. You have to stick to the country where you were born. Now, that makes no sense economically, and politically, it's unsustainable. What we're now doing is trying to hold back this tide, and history will show that it will fail. We can see this kind of strange picture through diverse examples in Europe. Spain, as the minister said, is on the front line of this. You see, just as there are people who get into flimsy boats from Cuba and Haiti trying to get to Florida, that you see people getting into pateras from West Africa and North Africa trying to get to the Canaries and to southern Spain. Many die in doing so. Many more are rescued, and many more get through. We see perhaps what's going to happen on the border between the US and Mexico already existing in two southern Spanish colonial outposts in North Africa called Ceuta and Melilla, where they built 3-meter-high walls with turrets and police fortifications. They didn't work. People still get across. So now they're doubling the height to 6 meters high. And still, people will get across. Why? Because people are desperate. Why? Because there are jobs on the other hand. And short of actually shooting people on sight, and even then it's not clear that would happen because it didn't work with the Berlin Wall, it's not going to stop getting people going through. At the same time in Europe, we have a very different picture emerging, which is the enlargement of the European Union to the poorer countries in Eastern Europe. And suddenly, 75 million people, the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Estonians, are free to come work freely in, for the moment, only 3 countries, Britain, Ireland, and Sweden. Now, if you believe people who say that immigration is somehow inevitable if we opened our borders, 75 million people now are able to come freely work in Britain if they want to. And if you believe the scaremongers, this would be the end of civilization as we know it. Actually, in a year and a half, 300,000 people have moved. There has been no increase in unemployment. There has been lower inflation. You see that actually people are very, very happy with the new migrants who have come to work in Britain. And because they can move back and forth freely, the questions of permanent migration do not arise. I strongly believe, and I think if you asked people, and certainly the people who I spoke to on my travels around the world, most people actually don't want to move permanently to another country. They want to come and work for a time in another country. But if you make it almost impossible for people to move, and if you make it almost impossible, make the penalties for doing so so high, well then, once people have moved, they're going to stay. Now, that's not what people want to do because they want to come and work temporarily and go home. It's not what the people who are building the barriers want because they want to keep people out. And so you get people staying permanently when actually they'd rather move back and forth freely. And that is what is happening that is what's happening now in Europe with respect to Eastern Europe, and it's working very well. And perhaps that's an example of how the world is going to move. I mean, the other example, classic example of this, of course, is Israel, which is open for all Jews to come. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, within the space of a few years, the population of Israel rose by 15%. Now, that's a pretty amazing rise in population in just a few years. And within a few years, all of those people were employed. Again, Israel did not collapse. So I think that there's the fear that we have about our borders being breached by hordes of people coming to destroy civilization as we know it are quite misplaced, and our means for doing so are not only inhumane, they're ineffective, and they're counterproductive. In the very interesting discussion we had this morning about the 12 million, I mean, at the end of the day, if the purpose of border controls is to keep people out, they're clearly failing. And if the purpose of border controls is to ensure security and the rule of law, then the creation of an underclass of people who have no rights and who have no stake in a system is clearly not achieving security or the rule of law. So, given that the fact that the rich need the poor, given the fact that the poor need the rich, there seems to be surely a better way of going about it than the way that we do now. I mean, the way that we try to manage migration globally at the moment is reminiscent a bit of the Soviet Union. People who are born in one place have to stay where they are. Imagine if we did this in America. It would be people who were born in Florida would have to stay in Florida. Occasionally, Washington would say, oh, we need some computer scientists. Florida will allow, 100,000 Floridians to go work in Washington State as computer scientists. Or occasionally then we'd say, well, no, actually, New York needs some agricultural workers, so we'll bust them in from some. These kind of, that's the way that we manage migration at a global level. It's not through the way that we manage it in any normal rational economy where workers are matched to employers through a market system. It's through arbitrary bureaucratic decisions. It's through controls which try and hold people in place. And the system obviously clearly cannot work. The way forward clearly has to lie through relaxation of those schemes, temporary workers schemes perhaps initially, perhaps going through, I used to work for the World Trade Organization, the way we went at the WTO, which is a progressive lowering of barriers, the transformation of these quantitative restrictions, limiting the number of people who can move, to price restrictions, saying, okay, well, if you want to keep out people, set a price, set a tax. What's the price for moving to America? And over time, as people become more relaxed, lowering that price, and thereby creating a genuine labor market which stretches across Latin America. These ideas will probably seem far-fetched to many people. I think the example of what's happening in the world suggests, in Europe suggests that they're not. It seems to me that the economic logic which underlies globalization, which requires people to move around the world increasingly, which requires us to move around the world increasingly, cannot be restricted to a small minority indefinitely. It simply won't work, and it shouldn't work. Thank you.